could all take our seats once again, that would be a very good thing. Please. If we could all please return to our seats. It's my pleasure to welcome to our next speaker, whom I have probably known the longest of all the speakers present, now that I think about it, because I first met the Bayer family, and I'm delighted to say Tom is with us as well, right back when I was assisting at the Church of Ascension and St. Agnes in Washington, D.C. And so we've known each other now for, what, 20 years or so, I think, almost, isn't it? Yes. So it's been a great pleasure. And of course, Dr. Bayer has served throughout that time in the cause of the prayer book, and for a large part of that time on the board of the Prayer Book Society, and was, of course, editor of the Anglican Way, which post is, of course, ne plus ultra. But anyway, she did herself, of course, study in Notre Dame, where she took her doctorate, and before that, she studied, of course, in Toronto, and managed to survive studying also, less probably, I think, for someone of her persuasions, at the London School of Economics, which was always a rather atheistical establishment, as I think of it. But she comes to us, of course, fresh from teaching, as is her regular wont of political philosophy, though, of course, it has a strong component, I think, from her perspective of the religious at Patrick Henry College. And today she will be discussing one of her particular enthusiasms, namely the work of Eric Mascall, someone of great distinction on the Anglo-Catholic side of things, and she's publishing her latest paper on him, as I recall, in the Journal of Anglican Studies. That's right. So, and that will be on a theme that she will touch on, I think, which is the timelessness of God. And as a fairly classical Thomist in this regard myself, I do, of course, commend that concept warmly. Accordingly, it's a great pleasure to welcome her back here today, and we will look forward to hearing Roberta Bayer on the Catholic mind of Eric Mascall.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Alistair. It's kind of fun to come to see everybody again. Anyway, okay, so, you know, this is a philosophy paper, really, more than a theology paper. Not transubstantiation. I do not touch on this.
There may be a need to speak up.
Oh,
if anyone
okay.
is not hearing, do come forward.
Okay.
Is that a microphone?
There is no microphone.
It's not a microphone.
Oh, it's a recorder. Okay, well then I do have to speak up.
Roberta unplugged.
Right, I know. Well, this is a philosophy paper because Mascall held philosophy to be necessary preparation to theology, and his work was very much centered on that view. And for him, in the 20th century, dealing with Oxford and London, living in England, where the philosophical world was fairly dim, the problem as he saw it was how reason was being conceived. Namely, as a kind of, mainly as incapable of reaching the truth. But that was not the teaching of Thomas Aquinas, nor, of course, of Augustine, nor of the Christian tradition, nor of the Catholic tradition, one might say. So the recovery of a Christian and Catholic philosophy is certainly one of the things which he's about. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about his understanding of reason as it should be conceived in philosophy. Okay, so the Reverend Dr. Eric Mascall, born in 1905 and dying in 1993, was a priest, academic, high churchman, and member of the Oratory of the Good Shepherd. Although he certainly preferred high church liturgy, it was not the aesthetics of Anglo-Catholic worship that marked his attachment to Anglo-Catholicism, and he rather made fun of it in some of his poems. He was very clever. He wrote funny little poems and collected them in a work called Pie in the High. That's P-I in the High, High Street, Oxford, which I recommend. Rather, his Catholicity lay in his affirmation of the doctrines of the Catholic faith, which he defended through the resources of metaphysical philosophy, or natural theology, as he called it. Natural theology demonstrates the ground for a belief in the existence of God insofar as God is known through reason, philosophy, to be unchanging, eternal source of being and goodness. The arguments that make up the body of natural theology within the Christian tradition are, he said, quite as true now as they ever were. Natural theology is not a progressive science, nor culturally determined. Knowing God's existence through philosophy is natural to mankind, while, of course, God's essence is known through revelation and faith. Faith, of course, does not destroy nature, meaning philosophy is not the enemy of faith, but rather faith perfects it, as Aquinas said. Now, Mascall's first important work on theology was He Who Is, which is, I think, back in print, which teaches several different approaches to theism in historical theology. His interpretation of Aquinas' 5 ways is well regarded in Roman Catholic circles. Existence and analogy, next, return to metaphysics and epistemology. And then the errors of modern analytical philosophy were addressed in words and images. And I would say that he would agree with some of the things that were said today about the importance of images to intellect. Now, a short list of his books on doctrine are Grace and Glory, The Triune God, The Man God, Christ, the Christian, and the Church, Whatever Happened to the Human Mind, and The Importance of Being Human, which gives you a gist of how he thought. But most importantly, and I do want to mention this, he wrote on faith and science in Christian theology and natural science, a book he was uniquely well placed to write as a mathematician. And he returned, of course, to that relationship in his Gifford lectures, The Openness of Being. He had passed the tripos in higher mathematics prior to becoming a priest. The tripos was taken at Cambridge at the height of that period in which quantum physics was, the professors at Cambridge were the experts in quantum physics. He also took an interest in Eastern Orthodox theology, participated in Anglo-Orthodox dialogue, and had friends among the emigre Russian Orthodox scholars in Paris. Very broad. But he was able to he was interested in all these traditions, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, and because he had a very Christocentric theology, and he was seeking that in all these different theologies. So he's, very much a man, not particularly interested in one church. Rather, he wants to restore the intellectual tradition of Christianity. Now, when he entered the priesthood in the 1930s, the Anglo-Catholic movement was full of defenders of natural theology. The best known would be Dorothy Sayers, V.A. Demont, Charles Williams, and of course one adds thinks of C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton for a while, Anglican before he converted. But of course also his friend and colleague at Oxford, Austin Farrer. As a Thomist, he was deeply influenced also by Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain, and he was, though at the same time, an astute observer of how different schools of thought in the Roman Catholic Church treated natural theology. And I think that his knowledge of the inner tensions within Roman Catholic thought, despite its putative external attachment to Thomism, held him from converting. He never did. Even after his friend Graham Leonard converted to Rome, he didn't. And he, of course, was quite appreciative of Nouvelle Théologie, insightfully commenting upon these different philosophical assumptions of work in Catholic theology. So to Mascall, everything was fodder for his Catholic mind. But I cannot end this introduction without mentioning that he also wrote that Pusey and Keble had impressed him by their triumphs in the slums and in the mission field. the Oxford movement's efforts to help the urban poor. Thus, he said the priestly life should reflect a view of reality and a way of life that form an integrated and coherent whole. It should be thus both contemplative and active. And thus he was happily situated in the oratory of the Good Shepherd, and later in retirement at St. Mary's, Bourne Street in London. But despite his mild manner and pious ways, in his books he was an indefatigable critic of his fellow churchmen who wavered in their orthodoxy. He opposed John Robinson's humanistic liberalism as thoroughly as Bultmann's demythologizing of the faith. I can imagine what he would have remarked about the contemporary claim that there is a need for renewal through re-enchantment. I think he would regard that as a very weak attempt to renew the faith without addressing why the faith is true. And of course, he excoriated those among his contemporaries who presented faith as a psychological crutch. In the late 1960s, he wrote, "In the servitude to the present that is characteristic of the radical theologians, there lies, I believe, a fundamental rejection of the claims of reason. We might suspect this from the very terms which they use to commend their doctrine: mature, adult, candid, contemporary, relevant, and of course, radical itself. But rarely," he said, "do they make a simple claim to be true." And thus today, I will briefly explain what Mascall means by reason, and this will include talking about what he means by intellect, which is the capacity of the mind which give us the power to know the existence of God. And to do this, I will start with an historical account of the mind as he knew it. So I'm going to begin with Boethius. In the Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius distinguished between two aspects of human knowing. The one is called reason, ratio, and the other intellect, intellectus. Now, ratio is active, reckoning, calculating. Ratiocination is an exercise of the reasoning powers by which the mind progresses step by step, moving from sensible to intelligible knowledge. Boethius wrote, "Reason transcends imagination and with a universal consideration reflects upon the species inherent in individual instances." Now, intellectus, or intellect, is passive, it's receptive, it is perceptive, it is discerning. Intellect gives us the power of understanding. Boethius wrote, "There exists the more exalted eye of the intelligence, which beholds the simple form with the pure vision of the mind. Through the intellect, the first principles are grasped or perceived, giving certain knowledge that things cannot be otherwise than they are. By this, as Plato notes, one grasps or intuits the form of the good, or as Aristotle said, being itself." Now, I'm going to say this again in the words of Joseph Pieper, because Mascall quoted this in his book, Words and Images. So Mascall thought this a good explanation. So Pieper wrote, "Is there such a thing as a purely receptive attitude of mind in which we become aware of immaterial reality and invisible relationships? Is there such a thing as pure intellectual contemplation, to adopt the terminology of the schools? In antiquity, the answer given was always yes. In modern philosophy, for the most part, the answer given is no. Kant, for example, held knowledge to be exclusively discursive, that is to say, the opposite of receptive and contemplative. But the philosophers of antiquity thought otherwise in this matter, though, of course, their view was very far from offering grounds for justification for those who take an easy path. The Greeks, Aristotle no less than Plato, as well as the great medieval thinkers, held that not only physical, sensuous perception, but equally man's spiritual and intellectual knowledge included an element of pure, receptive contemplation, or as Heraclitus says, of listening to the essence of things. Thus, in the Middle Ages, they drew a distinction between the understanding as ratio and understanding as intellectus. Ratio is the power of this discursive logical thought, searching, examination, abstraction, definition, drawing conclusions. Intellectus, on the other hand, is the name for understanding, insofar as it is the capacity of simplex intuitus, of that simple vision which offers itself like a landscape to the eye. And there you see the Catholic tradition on how the mind knows, from Boethius all the way up to Joseph Pieper, a modern Roman Catholic thinker, and of course Mascall is trying to point to this as in fact true. And simply to this whole tradition, or to Mascall, this analysis of the activity of knowing is demonstrably true by virtue of its very exercise. Moreover, as Mascall noted, our nature itself reveals we have two ends, one temporal and the other eternal, a fact to which even the ancient philosophers were not blind, not entirely blind. Moreover, reason and intellect are inseparable sides of knowing. Reasoning both begins and ends in the simple intuition that there is something to know. And the point is that reason and intellect are always operating together. Reason moves toward or from first principles, as Aristotle states. Losing sight of the activity of intellect in human thinking cannot but undermine any certainty of not only verities, but also of sense knowledge. And I mean, to draw the big conclusion, thus people think of faith as a feeling rather than as an act of the intellect, which of course it was for the medievals. So, thus losing sight of the activity of the intellect in human thinking cannot also, but also undermine any certainty, not only of eternal verities, but sense knowledge, and thus people think of faith as a feeling rather than as a truth, right? The separation of faith and reason is a result of our lacking this recognition that we have this receptive intellect in our mind. Faith and reason, thus divided, they become, we think in modernity, rooted in different aspects of the human personality. Or so it came about through the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Now, but Mascall had an education in higher mathematics. And this is really important to his attachment to the older understanding of ratio and intellect. In higher mathematics, he had perceived, apprehended, and understood truths that cannot be other than what they are. Obviously, there was necessarily a discovery of first principles in mathematics. Thus, to him, the mystery of human intelligence was better described by an Aquinas or Boethius than post-Cartesian philosophy. He affirmed without hesitation that there is a non-sensory and intellectual element in human perception which does not consist in inference, nor even confused or implicit inference, but in apprehension. That was a quote. The intellect grasps in a direct but mediated activity the intelligible extra-mental reality, which is being, the real thing, the objectum quo, using Thomistic language. The senses know something is there, the objectum quod, but its intelligibility, the objectum quo, offers meaning. He wrote, "This is why the physical sciences are so dominated by mathematics, for it is the intelligible and not the sensible characteristics of an object with which mathematics is concerned. Hence, for example, the same body of mathematical theory can deal with gravitational theory, electrostatics, and the hydrodynamics of non-viscous fluid. For in spite of their differences from the point of view of sense experience, these phenomena have, broadly speaking, the same intelligible mathematical structure and form." You see, he sees the Platonic forms through mathematics, at the basis of his study of mathematics. Number, as Plato said a long time ago, is a form, and it is by the intelligible form that one knows. Now, the fact that human beings have the capacity to think in such a way also, for Mascall, corresponds to the cosmological argument of Christianity, which is that the cosmos is created by mind, God, and man is placed at the center of creation. He lives on the frontier, quoting, where the two regions of matter and spirit impinge on each other. Mascall wrote, "With our minds we know, even prior to revelation, the existence of invisible or transparent realities such as the perfect idea of pure mathematics." The Pythagoreans of ancient Greece taught that if men want to achieve an exhaustive understanding of completely transparent realities, they must abandon everyday life and the physical science for contemplation. And Mascall also, as a result, repeated the old adage, adequatio rei et mentis, which is found in Thomas, which is translated, the mind is fitted to know the world, right? That the cause, because we are composed of soul and body, right? Because we are created in such a way to live on the frontier of matter and spirit. So it is also the fact that the mind was created in this world to know both spiritual knowledge and, of course, material knowledge. So he says, it is the neglect of this twofold functioning of the human mind that has so drastically impoverished the mental life of the modern world and produced the glacial and spectral character of much modern philosophy. This is his judgment on the logical positivism of someone like A.J. Ayer at Oxford. So he's at Oxford, he's seeing the analytical philosophy, the linguistic positivism, and he's arguing against it by saying this is not what philosophy is. This just is not philosophy. It's something else, but it's not natural. It's not what the tradition calls philosophy. Now here is an overly quick account. I will just give this again, I'm apologizing, this is quick, but of why modern philosophy became what it is. So, simply speaking, the rise of natural sciences led philosophers in the early modern period, most of whom, Descartes, Locke, Hobbes, were engaged in the study of the natural world at the same time. And it led them to presuppose that the study of philosophy or human nature must also attain to the same kind of truth as science, by the same methods. So to arrive at truth and avoid error, the mind must, as far as possible, detach itself from the object and attend only to the object's sensible characteristics and confine its own activity to observation and ratiocination. That's what comes out of Descartes. While this search for objective truth, as Mascall states, is right to the pursuit of the physical sciences, it is not the right kind of attention which must be paid to another person to know that person, or indeed to have insight into the inner meaning of nature. And thus he continued to speak of contemplation as the means by which human beings know the essences of things, because science can't give you that knowledge, because one is looking at things from an objectified way, which denies that adequation, that relationship between the mind and the thing. Instead, for Descartes, you had to reconstruct out of your own mind what that relationship is. It's not simply given. So, Descartes, thus, as everyone knows, affirmed his own existence and the existence of God with the I think, I therefore am, moving from skepticism to the affirmation that he knew he existed. And he added to this an ontological argument for God, who he asserted is not a deceiver, and proceeded, therefore, to argue for the existence of an external world as simply a counterpart to the ideas that he found in his own mind. Now, this theory, as it was developed, so there's no natural relationship between oneself and the mind. You have to actually rediscover. The world is just, all you know is what's in your mind. And then science is going to help you learn the external world. Now, this theory, of course, starts the subsequent history of epistemological philosophy, and via Locke and Berkeley, philosophy arrived at a pure sensationalism by means that they come to argue that we only know the ideas in our own mind and nothing else. Ending in the philosophy of David Hume, for whom sense impressions were the only real existence, and both minds and physical objects were merely bundles of sense expressions. It's sort of the height of solipsism. And this retreat from the external world into a world of sensation, of course, failed to provide infallible knowledge, but rather an extreme skepticism. Kant attempted to overcome the skepticism of Hume with the categorical imperative, but as Nietzsche summed up, he was only a great delayer, and did not prevent, or it doesn't prevent Wittgenstein from arguing that the fundamental constituents of the universe are not objects which cannot be known by the senses, but rather fact, complex. An attempt to recreate some content knowledge when at the same time you're denying you can know anything. On the continent, the response to Cartesian skepticism was the philosophy of phenomenology, but it was the logical positivism in the English world which Mascall critiqued in his book Words and Images. There he points out that for A.J. Ayer, there was no desire to give up the word mind, but mind was no longer a substance, i.e. it no longer had any reality. It was merely a word that referred to certain qualities, such as sagacity or caution or mental processes. And God, of course, too, becomes a facet of mental processes, hence no more natural theology. But bad philosophical theories affect theology. And in attempting to make doctrines more palatable by reducing them to what did not suit, to what suited modern ideas of reason, was not the solution. Consequently, Mascall remarks of his own generation. The chief weakness of the Catholic movement was the assumption that all church people had imbibed with their mother's milk, or at any rate learnt at their mother's knee, 9/10 of the Catholic religion without knowing what it was, and that all they needed to turn them into fully informed Catholics was to add a few admittedly very important extras concerning confession, the real presence, prayers for the dead, and veneration of the saints. But what they need to know above all is that the incarnation of the eternal Word is not a past episode, but a continuing reality. That God has taken our nature so that we might be taken into his. That nature is really transformed by grace and not merely adorned by it. Such pervasive and orienting essentials of Catholicism seem to have been simply taken for granted by our scholars. They need to understand their own capacity as a creature who is made in the image of God to know both sensible and supersensible reality. The consequence being that instead of penetrating the church as a whole, they have been first ignored and then treated as irrelevant. So you go back, you see what he just said. He said that in fact the incarnation is a continuing reality, that God has taken our nature so that we could be taken into his, and that nature is really transformed by grace and not merely adorned it. This point about the continual existence of God in reality, he brought it up over and over and over again in his books, because to him it was, of course, a true doctrine, the true doctrine of the incarnation, but to him it was being proved by the ancients, although they don't know it, in their recognition of forms of things, that there are eternal verities in everything. And then Christianity then can teach why Aristotle and Plato knew that. Because, of course, we know that the incarnate God lives and moves and has his being in everything. I mean, God is moving all the time in everything. And this is his fundamental metaphysical argument when it comes to talking about being. And so he says, this is why, although when people come to think of nature as something which can only be understood through the scientific method, in fact, they're just looking at it as a kind of a dead thing. And consequently, reason takes up a sort of objectification of reality, which in fact is fundamentally opposite to the truth of what reality is. And so I'm going to stop there because I think that's enough. But that is fundamentally, I think, the reason why one can talk about him as having sort of as being a great conveyor of the Catholic teaching about the human mind is necessarily tied to our knowledge of reality, informed then through the doctrine of the incarnation.